All right. Hello, everyone. Those of you who are joining us live, those of you who are watching this video after the fact, we are super glad that you are joining us today. I am excited to be chatting with Lanette. And as you know, with all of these conversations that I have, they are less interview and more conversation. And I was just sharing with Lanette that because our journeys have been very busy lately, we haven't had a chance to catch up. And she is one of those people who just has a natural way of making people feel excited and feel joy and tap into those things about themselves that they feel best about. And I have missed that. So I'm excited both to be able to introduce her to you, but honestly, just to be here present with her, having this conversation and being able to hear her perspective and joy. So thank you, Lanette, very much for making time to join us today.
There is no place I'd rather be. I'm so excited to be in your energy and yeah, like you said, to catch up, but also just to share some information that might be helpful to somebody else along their way.
Yeah, I've said to people that it's funny, I don't pay a lot of attention to the user count only or the viewer count only because in my mind, it's to me, I'm absolutely positive that for every one of these conversations, there is at least one person who hears something that's of value to them and that
Yeah.
makes it all worth it. Plus, we just, like you said, get to have a cool conversation. So I like to start off by having the guest introduce themselves and talk about what they do because I love the
Yeah.
way you phrase things and can people hear where you emphasize certain points, and then we'll get into our conversation. So if you want to tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Lanette Pottle coming to you live from small town Maine, and I am the founder of the She Gets Published brand. And what I do primarily is I help female coaches become authors that attract clients, elevate their authority, and their influence. So, really, I feel like my purpose in the world is to help elevate other people and to elevate other women's voices. Being able to do that through books has been a real joy for me.
Yeah, and one of the things I really want to talk about with that, Lynette, and I'm gonna go right into this because I think it'll go into all the other topics I want to cover naturally. One of the things that's a really important topic that I talk about a lot when I'm just in my life in general, not just professionally and with clients, is that everybody's story has so much value and
Mm,
importance, and that we tend to think like, oh, well, there's a lot of this type of role in the world, so why am I needed? And yet what's unique to each person is their story, their experiences, their voice, and the value that we have when we share that. And certainly there's many ways we can share our stories, but one way that we can share our story is through writing. And
yes.
particularly lately, leading up to this conversation, which may have just been very fortuitous, I've been speaking to a lot of people who are at either a specific stage in their life or their career, and they're kind of trying to think, like, I know I want to do something, I'm not sure what I want to do. And either prior to them saying that or right after saying that, proceed to share these remarkable stories about things that they've encountered that I'm like, there were like golden nuggets in there that would be really important for somebody to hear, either because they've never experienced it and they're going to go, oh, I can apply that, or they have experienced it and they're going to go, oh, okay, I'm not alone. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, because you do and you say it so beautifully, why everybody has a story that's worth sharing. And of course, that carries into the coaches specifically, but in general, that's worth sharing, and why writing can be a great way to share that with the world.
Yeah, and I love the way that you just said that, right? Because it's like I'm not alone. I think that is the biggest piece because in a lot of our stories, things that feel mundane are like, why would anybody care about that? It is that connection. Stories are about connection. And yes, we can use stories for messaging and we can use them to illustrate learning points. But at the end of the day, it really is about connection. And our world is craving, I think, just as a society, we're craving more connection, and stories help to do that. So, I had a conversation with a gal not too long ago at a networking event, and she knew I was in publishing and a book coach. And she said, I've had this dream about writing this book, but what stops me is I think, why would somebody, if someone saw my book in the bookstore sitting next to Mel Robbins, why would they buy my book? And it's like, why wouldn't they pick up both? And I think that's
Mm,
part of the reframe is if we look at our, if I look over at my bookshelf or you look at yours, we have multiple books on the same topic because it comes from a different point of view. It brings home a different message. And our lived experiences, no one has lived our life. No one has
right,
our way of sharing a particular story. And like, you're just not going to click with everybody either, right? You might hear somebody say the same thing 20 times, but then
right.
one person shares a similar message and you just feel a kinship. You feel seen and heard and valued. It's about that human connection, and story is so good. And story doesn't have to be, it isn't have to come about as a memoir or
Right.
a, a big piece like that. I think you pointed that out beautifully. It's about writing in general. And our stories can show up on a social media post, or they can show up in a book, or they can show up in poetry, things we're writing only for ourselves. Stories can help us process. There's so many different things, but what I've come to know for sure is when we deny our stories, when we hold down our stories, that's when we can get into a dark place. I've been there myself, so I know that being able to share in some form is also a really good mental health um, check as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and what you just said too about sometimes it's writing for yourself as well, right? Whether you choose to
Mhm.
do the publication process, though I think there's something very empowering about saying I'm putting this story out to the world because in our minds there's something that's going to happen when people find out these pieces of us or we put it out there. But
Mhm.
ultimately whether one person purchases the book or thousands of people purchase the book, your story is out there and it's got value and it's on paper and people can look at it, and the things that you thought were going to somehow destroy you if they came out don't. Right, there's going to be those people that are going to read it. And that's like with journaling, right? Like, I mean, I started writing my diary when I was little, and I mean, it was a bonding experience. We joke about dear diary, but I mean, in many ways that journal to me was a friend. Like, it's going
Yeah.
to be there at the end of the day. I'm going to write in it. I can remember writing things like, dear diary, it's really late, can't say much, good night, dear diary. Like, I needed to check in even if
Yeah.
I didn't have time to write more. And why is that? What you just said, and you said it so profoundly, that like validation of self, of identity.
Mhm.
When we put it on paper, it's like we're confirming to ourselves and to the greater world at large, I'm worth it. And what does that say? When I say I'm worth it, that also says you're worth it, right?
Yes.
Because it's everybody that reads that and goes like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, that like silly story that happened to you in 3rd grade that stuck with you all these years but has had an emotional impact." Like, oh, I get that. That is worth it. That is impactful. That does make a difference in my life. And it's very, very healing. And I've seen that with your posts about people that you've worked with.
Yeah.
The joy that exudes before anybody's even purchased their book. From the moment of publication, the joy that exudes from those folks because they have worked with you and they have gotten to that step and they're holding that in their hand. That's powerful.
It is so powerful. The process of writing is very cathartic as well. And so that's that piece about, sharing your story. But if I can, I want to, this just brings up for me, this is a little bit of a piece of vulnerability, but it makes me think of, sharing our stories. And sometimes I'm asked, how do you know what stories to share or what you should really keep to yourself?
Right.
And for a long time, I was well into my 30s, but I was always outrunning the story of my past. And I didn't want people to know I had been a teenage mother. I became pregnant at 17, had my son my senior year of high school, never went to college. And so part of what my way of dealing with that was I became an overachiever. I never wanted to be in a situation like in my work situations. I always had the answers. I read all the fine print of everything because I didn't want somebody to ask me something I didn't know. And I refrained from putting myself in rooms like now it makes me cringe to think about, but I wanted to be in rooms where I was the smartest person because I didn't want somebody asking me a question about what college I went to, right? I was running from all of that. And what a shame that I went through so much time, but that's part of my growth journey.
Right.
But as soon as I shared that story, and I remember the first time I told that, and how not only was it freeing to me to be able, it's like that wasn't being held over my head in some way, like somebody was going to find out this dark secret about me, but it was also in how it impacted the women in the audience that heard this story. And what I've come to find over time is that many overachievers, part of their journey, like what's brought them to that place, is also it's like proving that they're better than something. For me, it was better than where I came from, better from my past. Um, and so I've done a lot of, now I'm in my 50s, so I've done a lot of work around that. But the first time you're sharing that story, I think it is important, I mentioned it being cathartic. It's one thing to write it down, but when you're going to share it, you certainly want to share from a story that's healed. You don't want to be
Right.
picking at scabs and sharing things that you haven't processed. That can, back to the mental health
Right.
aspect of it. You want to make
Right.
sure that you're prepared for that. And sometimes I work with clients also that have people on their team. They're working with a therapist in conjunction with the work that they're doing, because they know they're going to be open and honest and to be able to serve in the highest way. They're going to be sharing some things that have the potential to be uncomfortable and to stir up some old feelings. So I think you have to be really mindful of that as well as when you're sharing.
Right. And I love that you noted that, because it is as freeing as it can be. We do want to do it in a way that's going to be
Yeah,
emotionally strategic, right? That
it's
we're considering the
yes,
implications. For me, some of my stories have other people involved with them. And now, if it's a story where it's very clearly my story to tell and somebody else is in it, I can tell it and just omit the names. But in some cases, there's going to be stories that omitting the name is not going to omit the name, right? Like, people are going to be
right,
very easily able to kind of like, oh, okay, right? If I'm talking
yes,
about a parent in childhood, people are going to know parent in childhood. So I've checked,
yes,
for me, and this different journeys for different people, different situations.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
for me, part of my approach forward as I'm starting to work on some of these, works to come, was to touch base with some people that were part of these stories and make sure that, like, are you okay with me sharing it? Is there anything that we need to talk about ahead of time, etc. And that has given me the ability to write more clearly, because I already knew what the perceptions of the other people were and talked it through. So I think that has to do with that mental health piece.
Yeah.
And of course, you're right. You don't want to share something if you're not fully healed, because you are going to get a response and it is going to warrant conversation. I mean, that's what sharing elicits, right? When you post something
Yeah.
on social media, people are going to comment. When you produce a book, people are going to read it and there's going to be a response. So you need to be
Mhm.
prepared to handle those conversations. And on the other thing, I was thinking, for me, when I was going through one of my worst periods with depression and anxiety, and I had struggled with it for most of my life, right? I can remember episodes in elementary school. We didn't know then that's what it was. It was more like, okay, Deb's really sensitive. But
Mhm.
now I look back and go like, oh my gosh, that's why I was struggling. But I was
Mm.
going through this difficult period and I was trying to explain it to people, and I just couldn't find the words because it didn't make sense to me. It was like the darkness that I was feeling, even though there were some difficult circumstances, but it was like this degree of darkness. Like, it didn't make sense. And so
Mm.
I was reading online and came across, and I've shared about this before, somebody had written something about this feeling of grotesque horror. And I was like,
Mm.
that's it. That's the phrase. And what's interesting for me is reading that phrase, reading somebody else refer to their anxiety and depression as grotesque horror, was one of the most monumental moments of healing movement for me, because I was like, that's it. Somebody feels
Yeah.
it. And if that person had not shared that, which probably to some people they'd be like, what do you mean grotesque horror? Like, you've got a couple things going wrong and you're experiencing grotesque horror. So I always try to keep that in mind too, that once I am healed, because you're right, very
Mhm.
important, very important. Once I'm healed, some of those things that I might think like, oh gosh, that was a really difficult period, is that necessarily going to help somebody? But I think it does when you can share being on the other side of it.
Yes.
That I read that phrase and I was like, oh, okay, this is a thing and we're going to address this. And this is what I've experienced my whole life. So when you just shared about, I mean, I got goosebumps when you were sharing that story. it's
Mm.
not an experience in itself I can relate to, but I can relate to the experience of sharing things that you're just not necessarily sure how that's going to all unfold, or
Yeah.
even necessarily the words that are going to come out when you're in the middle of the story, even if you've rehearsed it 30 times. Like
Yes.
all of a sudden you're saying something and you're like, all right, then, guess we're going there. So, bracing yourself for that. And to your point, that sense of, I'm being real and authentic right now. Like I'm
Mhm.
owning this, and whatever's going to come from this, I'm declaring out loud that this does not change my value, increase or decrease, right? Because I think we're all like, nobody's better than, nobody's less than. To your point, the book next to Mel Robbins, awesome. I love her, but I don't love her any more than I would love the book next, because we all have those
Mhm.
incredible pieces of brilliance to share.
Yes. Yeah. We do. And we minimize that in ourselves. And it's we are so fortunate when we have someone in our life that can hold up the mirror and help us to see moments or some of that glistening brilliance. And I also acknowledge that not all people have that at all times. Seeking it
Right.
out, I think, is a really important thing. And knowing that the things that we take for granted, the things that come easy to us, also, I think about this a lot. The things that come easy to us, we discount. We think, nobody really cares about that.
Right.
And then you have somebody over here is just marveling, someone that's watching your YouTube channel just explode, right? And not to minimize, it's been a heck of a lot of work for you, but it's been easier, the technical task of it, maybe, than it would be for
Right.
someone else. For someone that's sitting and telling themselves a story about how technology is a barrier to what they want to do, they're looking at you and marveling, where you're just like, I'm just doing the work. Like, I know what I need to
Right.
do and I'm executing. So those pieces of the story and having somebody and valuing ourselves for what we do have to offer. So like, what does come easy? Okay, maybe somebody would want to know about that.
Right.
There's
And
probably a
sharing
story
some,
about that.
right. To your point, those 1, 2, 3 steps, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I think sharing with people so that they can understand the actual course you took. And you're right. I mean, it has been a lot of work, but I absolutely agree that I'm sure some of the technical, because I had some background experience
right.
in stuff that helped me with that. So it was applying those things and then, putting in the long hours. You noted, two pieces to something that you said about putting ourselves in the presence of people that, help us see those pieces of ourselves
Mm,
and understand the value. First, I mean, you're one of those people, right? And I've shared that with you offline, online, etc., because I think you do a really good job of giving specific, focused feedback. Because it's one thing to tell somebody like, "Oh, you're really great," but when you really feed into like, "I just noticed you did this and I liked how you did that." So I think like one thing that's really great for people to know if you're trying to feed into people is to try to give specific feedback that's going to let people know, I'm not just saying this because I think everybody's a value, but in addition to that, I also see this specific thing in you.
yeah,
And then I also think on the receiving end of that, I think it's important for us to note when people bring that to us so that we can attract that type of feedback, right? Like, you don't always know. There's times I'll say something to somebody and I don't know until like weeks later, they'll be like, oh my gosh, the past few weeks have been so different for me because you said this
hmm,
specific phrase. And I'm thinking in my mind, not that I didn't intend it to be helpful, but I didn't expect it to be as helpful as it was. And now I know, and I go, okay, so I'm gonna, for that person, that is the specific type of feedback they like. So I think it's a give and take on both sides. On the giving end, to try to be mindful of noting something specific, and on the receiving end, let people know when they have fed into you, because
yeah,
like that, for me, when somebody tells me that I've said something that has helped them, like, I don't need credit, you don't need to post it anywhere, but like I now
yeah,
know, like, keep going, Deb, you're doing, like, that was a good step that you just took.
yeah. Yeah, and there's this whole cycle, this whole giving and receiving cycle. It sparks, it's kind of sparks another idea, but it's this point of also allowing ourselves to receive. So when we're getting that feedback, how often do we just kind of like discount it?
Right.
It was nothing, um, or minimize it in some way. So being able, there's a skill and an awareness around receiving that but also communicating that back, mirroring it back. It's such an important thing. I think, and this applies to everything, whether it's the workplace, certainly, and I have
Right.
20 years experience in human resources, so I know those things are important in the workplace, but just in our human, showing up as humans and showing up for each other in the world, whether it's somebody that you've met online or somebody that's at the grocery store, that you
Right.
might meet. I think it's just a way of being. That's the way I see
Yeah.
it, a way of being. It isn't that you have to calculate it and come up with exactly the right thing to say. It's just show up and be.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. And it becomes natural, right? You find
Mm-hmm.
yourself doing it without thinking about it. And, I talk a lot about kindness and I kind of go into the
Yeah,
science of it because they're really kindness actually physically helps the giver and the receiver. I mean,
absolutely.
there's nobody that will disagree with that. No, there's different techniques and approaches that people apply to how you should be kind. And kindness is not I'm going to let people do whatever they want to me. Boundaries can
Yeah.
live in alignment with kindness because you're got to be kind to yourself. But it does become that. I'm kind of curious because for you, I know that people come to you with I've got the idea, I've got the outline, I'm ready to go. And then there's other people that come to you like, I think I want to do this. So I mean, some people even come up to you and they're like, I don't think I want to write a book, but what do you do? And then by the end of the conversation, they're like, when can we start? So I know that you have a wide audience. So I guess as to what degree you want to kind of address a specific category or broadly, when people are coming to you with their story, because I've watched your strategies, what is kind of how do you feed into somebody the confidence that gets them from the either no idea, the outline, whatever stage they're at into producing that book? What are some of the key pieces of Lanette that have given people this success I have seen?
I know this is going to sound really simple, but it's not always practiced well. And whether somebody's coming to me, like you said, I work with a lot of brilliant women. They've got experience, life experience, professional experience, and they show up and it's like, oh, I've got like 4 ideas, and I'm not sure which one is the best, or if it's one book or 4 books, and it's kind of like too much. And really, the very first thing that I'm doing is allowing them space and really listening, deeply listening to what they're saying and reflecting back. One thing I can say for sure is, and sometimes I don't know, it's like, is everybody able to do this, or is this something that I've honed? I really don't know the answer. But when someone is sharing like these 4 ideas, I can tell, like, their energy changes, their body language changes when it's the idea, you know the thing that they're meant to write about. And it isn't always the thing that's most comfortable. It's usually not the first thing that comes to their mind, because the thing that they really have that deeper desire is scary. It's on a growth edge. So sometimes it's easier to bury that a little deeper. But it's asking thoughtful questions, really leaning in and listening and reflecting back what they're saying, and getting to the place, because it's not my book. It's never my book,
Mm,
right? So it's not what I want or what I think the world needs. It's what is it that they're being led to share, and what is their goal behind sharing it. That's another thing with stories in general.
mm,
Like, what is the purpose of the story? I have stories that I love to tell that have no value other than just like they bring me a lot of joy,
yeah.
and it's a fun story to tell. But I don't share them a lot because it doesn't demonstrate a point that I'm trying to teach, or it brings the spotlight on me when it's really about the person that I'm talking about. So I don't want to interject
Mm,
my story into their space. So it's, what is the goal of this story, of this idea? How do you want to use it? What is the purpose of it? Is it to create a movement? Is it to attract more clients? Is it to do both? I mean, it can be a number of things, but that also is one of those lenses that we can look through to get to the heart of what's the right message. And there's a lot of stories, right? That's the point of um, one of the exercises that I have people do is actually creating a story bank. And are you familiar with a story bank? Have you ever done story banking?
I mean, it sounds familiar maybe when you talk more about it, but I mean, in my mind, what it is may not be. So I'm not going to give you my what I think it is and get people off on Deb's version.
Yeah, no. So essentially, I think of it as this little treasure trove that you can go back in and use it. Some of the stories that are here will end up in your book. Some will be social media. Some will never be anywhere. It might bring you a spark of joy or an intense learning, a reminder of something from the past. But a story bank is a place where you're not writing out full stories. Like you're
Right.
not writing the whole maybe 10-page story, but you're writing a bullet point to remind you, oh, remember that time where had the problem with the tech and you found the solution yourself, or,
Right.
some
Right.
kind of just enough that's going to spark the memory for you.
Right.
And you have this collection of stories that you can tap back into. And it's like, you know what? I really need something extra to demonstrate this point or to show a practical application of how this will work. A lot of times with coaches, right, it might be a concept or a theory. And it's like, that doesn't stick. We know that's not sticky. People are going to forget about that. I think the statistic is for 90% of the time, for 90% of people, they forget within a week. So you need to have something that makes it sticky, like a story.
Right. Right.
And you can go back to that bank. So it's just a collection of ideas, and you can go about creating it in a number of ways. You can do a chronological timeline. I have actually, if anybody's watching and wants it, they can shoot me a message on Instagram and I'll send it to them. But I have like 101 story bank prompts. And while you might not have a story for each of those prompts, what it inevitably does is it sparks another idea. And it's just all of these little things, mundane things, an interaction at the grocery store, again, back to the grocery store, things that we're doing in everyday life actually could serve to demonstrate a practical use of a particular, concept. So having that you can tap into is a great way of, again, I got a little off into a tangent there, so I apologize.
No,
But
no, I don't think you did it at all. I think that that's because what you're talking about is in order to get people from the whatever stage they're at, you want them to
yeah,
really tap into their life's journey and what have been the pieces that have stuck out to them, right? Like if you graph, there's a friend of mine who's because I was an English teacher, she's still an English teacher. She does this life chart thing that she had learned where you plot things out, right? So I think like there's these different moments, and sometimes you find that these things that were not insignificant, but at least you didn't think they were profound until you look back at them, right? Like I have this story
mhm.
about how I wanted a chimpanzee when I was a kid that has
Oh
become
gosh.
central to one of my keynote, well, a couple of my keynote speeches. It's become really critical to because in like 2011 I was like reflecting on it, was like, oh my gosh, like that was like really impactful to me. But like, if you don't really think about that, you're like, okay, what does that have to do with anything, right? Like what does Deb wanting a
Mhm.
chimpanzee when she was a little kid have to do with anything? So that story bank does help people because as they make those connections, like anything, right? It's like a win list. It reminds us that we are this incredible source of inspiration and education, etc. So I
Yeah.
think and Deb's version of a story bank and yours were the same. So I'm glad to hear that. I just didn't want to like start saying, well, this is what I think, but yeah. And so I have a couple methods, and I try to, I keep notes on my phone, which is usually just me
Yeah.
texting myself if something comes to me, and then I try to transfer them over into a book. I do have a typed list, but I like to have them in a written thing because for me, it's the creative process or something when I'm writing things down and I'm kind of drawing arrows and connecting like, oh, this story's got a similar point to this story. So like whether I'm writing or speaking, I could segue here and that would be good to ask this question. So I think that that's really a valuable thing. And look, even outside of writing, going back to what you were talking about for journaling, well, it is writing,
Yep.
but outside of publishing, we'll say outside of publishing, writing down those stories about your life can be very healing for you as well, in the same way that it would help you to feed into being able to publish a book. It feeds
Mm.
into you recognizing the ways you've been resilient throughout your life, the ways you've learned throughout your life, the ways that you've adapted, right? Because a lot of people will say, like, oh, I'm just not a quick learner, or I don't handle
Mm.
change well, or I haven't really had any impactful moments. And then they start to go, like, oh, wait a minute, I was placed in this unfamiliar situation. I was switched to a different little league team when I, had been with this other team for 2 years and had to adjust to all these different changes and I rocked it. And you're like, oh, I actually was like a change genius. But as an adult in a an executive position in a corporation, you're not generally speaking going to sit back and be like, "What did I do in second grade that may have really helped me?" And yet, they can turn back to like, "What did I do then? What were the techniques I used that allowed me to be successful?" Oh, it was the fact that I'm friendly. It was the fact that I'm creative. And then they can attach those things. So I think story banks are just cool things to have anyway.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
writing in general is, and it's certainly the case with a book, but any kind of writing, it's a personal growth journey. It's an exercise in personal growth and personal development. I think anyway, because when you're writing, when you're recalling that, and now that you have different life experience, it's that looking back and connecting the dots. I mean, you have a different viewpoint of things, and you can see how relevant. I'm writing a book right now, and there's a story that shows up that I was like, oh, I really didn't expect that was going to be here, but it's like that is the perfect story to tell here. And I'd almost forgotten about it. And if it hadn't been for it was going through my story bank, that was like, oh, right, this is a good one. This
Yeah.
demonstrates exactly what I want to say. Where if I didn't have a record of it, it's not something, because it was from a long time ago. It wasn't,
Right.
it wasn't a case study. It wasn't working with a client. It wasn't something that I had experienced in my professional life. It was actually the first time I had gotten roped into being in a pageant. My one and only pageant for a reason. But I went into that, and the one thing that I was feeling relatively confident about was the interview portion. And I was looking forward to that. And prior to doing that, you had to write about what you wanted to do as a profession, when you got out of high school or whatever. I was 17. I had just turned 17 when this happened. And so this was again, I said I'm in my 50s. So it was pre Google. There was not, personal computers. I was going to a dictionary to proofread my work, and I was going over everything meticulously. And my career ambition at that time was to be either a journalist or in advertising. It was kind of one of those things. And the interview portion was going great. They were going over that. And then the last judge, oh my gosh, she chastised me. She told me that I would never work in journalism with such sloppy work. Like, she just tore me to shreds. And I'm like, there's this one part of me in that moment that was wanting to justify, like, show me where, because I knew how much time I had put into proofreading and making it right. But then on the other side of me, it was just stand there and receive it, right? You just need to take this. And who do you think you are? And it shrunk me down. And it's just the things that we don't even, I never considered that experience impacted my hesitation in sharing work in the future as an adult. I didn't make that connection right away. And as I talk about it, it seems like, oh, well, that's really obvious. But as we just go about living our lives, we don't think about those things, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but our subconscious does. Our subconscious holds on to it really well for us. Our inner mean girl, she's really great at reminding us of those things. But anyways, yeah, just our life experiences are rich, and you never know what story is going to be valuable to be able to help and support a message you're trying to give, or just help support somebody where they're at. The thing
Right.
about stories is, like you said, it wasn't like you couldn't relate to being a teenage mother and that story, that part of my story, but what you can relate to is how that must have felt. You probably have had a time in your life, or most people have had a time in their life where they have something they don't want other people to know about. And like what that would feel like if somebody did, or how it might make you feel. And you tap into the emotion and the energy of that, and that's where the human connection takes place.
Yeah, and I think too, when we acknowledge those things for ourselves and for others, because there are going to be things about our pasts that aren't great. So I can't think of an example, but let's say I robbed a bank. I'm going to use an example like that because I think most people would say you shouldn't rob a bank, right? There's not really a.
This is going to be
I'm
the
sure
sound
there's.
bite that we get from this.
Right,
Deb
right,
robbed a bank.
exactly. Deb robbed a bank. So let's say you robbed a bank, right? That isn't a good thing. There's not really much you're going to do unless there was some really, really charitable reason that you were robbing some really evil bank. But in general, most people are going to agree you shouldn't rob a bank. So that piece of my past, if I had done that, would not be something that I can really necessarily cast in a positive light. So
Right.
it's not that we're going to take everything that we've ever done and say it was beautiful, it was perfect, it was, but what do we take from it? We're not the
Yeah.
person, or we are the person, but we're not in the position or the circumstances we were in when that happened. And we can grow and change. And so it's, I remember going through a period where I was struggling with some things in my life, and it's way too much to tell the whole context. But I'm just going to kind of get to this one main point that I was struggling with some misinformation that had been shared about me. And my brother and I both share nobody likes to not be liked. But if somebody doesn't like me for some legitimate part of me, as sad as it is, I'm like, okay, they just don't see me from that perspective. But when somebody doesn't like me for something that they think is the case, I'm like, but, and sometimes you have to accept that, like, you're not going to get on the other side of that narrative, whoever they're hearing the story from or wherever they got the misinformation from. So at this particular circumstance in my life, there was some misinformation, and it was really challenging for me because I knew that if I could clarify it, right, that it would fix a lot of things, but like I probably wasn't going to be able to clarify this piece of information. But as part of it, I was starting to have this fear of other realities about me being found out and being misinterpreted, right? So it started to create this bigger thing. And my brother said to me, he's like, Deb, we could show your life on a movie screen to the whole world, and nobody would say to you, you shouldn't be here. Nobody would run away from you. Nobody would. And I was like, and granted, I had not robbed a bank or done anything of those nature, but I think his point was like, you're right, you're not gonna change this narrative, but you know your truth and you know your reality, and that's what you have to live in. That whatever things you may or may not have done in the past, whatever mis stories are out there, you know your truth, and that's what you're going to live in, and that's what you're going to believe in. And so I think about that piece of advice a lot. Like when I'm doing things and I start to feel regret or I feel guilt or I feel fear, I check myself on, like, if the world watched this on a movie screen, would they really be thinking I hate Deb Harrison? And most of the time, I would hope people are going to arrive at the conclusion that no way they would not. And if you are afraid, then there is, of course, the opportunity for us to start fresh and for us to effect change in our lives with people around us. And so when you free people to share those stories, you are giving them the format for that to be the, symbolic movie of their life and be loved wholly and completely. Now, you also noted, because you're a writer, right? And I love your writing. And I'm glad that judge didn't silence you completely. I cringe thinking about any adult speaking into any youth in that way. I will say connection point. So when I always wanted to either be a journalist, a photographer, an English teacher, or some combination of all of those rolled in together. And I was an English teacher for many years, but I think you write, and you've got a really cool process of combining the flow of it, right? The like sit and let the ideas come and be very natural and not try to put it in a box. But you also have very good strategy, because I've watched this on social media posts and I've heard you talk about it, and I've seen the success in the people, what people have produced and what you've produced. Can you share a couple of the tips for you? So outside of how you inspire other people, what has worked for you to get you from idea to finished work?
Yeah, such a great question. So I've developed a system actually over the course of time, the rapid write system, but some of the pieces of that, one is a good old fashioned brainstorm where there's not that pressure of like, I need to create an outline like, ninth grade English class, or something that would live in academia.
Right.
Or a table of contents even. It's like starting to get, what are all the ideas that I have about this topic that I think I want to write about? and getting those out. And the tool that I use is Post-it notes. I should own stock in this company because, or have a brand partnership or something, because oh my gosh, it's a central
Insider
part
tip, because
of
Lanette's writing a book right now. Everybody go out and buy stock and Post-it notes.
oh my
Oh gosh,
goodness.
I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know if that's just to forget that I said that. I erase that statement. I'm not giving any stock tip advice at all. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Carry on with your story.
Yes. But getting each idea out, like a main topic point, out on a Post-it note, and I kind of start arranging these. And a funny story with the book that I'm working on right now, I was actually in Florida helping my daughter for a few weeks, and I knew that I still needed to make movement on my book to meet my timelines and the goals that I'd set for myself. So I started this process in her spare bedroom, and I've got big Post-it notes, the like flip chart size, and then I've got little Post-it notes color coded, and I put them on a particular color if it's like a main topic, or is it a story point, is it a statistic, is it research. But I get all of these out, and then I'm moving them around. I take some time away from it, because it's the stepping back also that helps you to have perspective when you come back. It's like, well, what was I even thinking here? Like, I don't know what that means. And if I
Right.
can't find the flow, it helps me. But it's a little more in depth than that. But that's the high level view of it. Is it's using a tool that's very visual, that doesn't feel like you're boxed in. It allows you to be creative, but also it helps you to find your flow, to the point of like, now, okay, I get it. I see this now. I'm going to translate this, and I'm going to move it to create like my table of contents or a formal
Right.
outline based on what I've got here. And I've got something to work with that's really tangible, and well thought out. But there's pre-work you're even doing before that, because it's
Right.
back to the goal of what are you trying to do with this book. And that's the step that a lot of people, as it relates to a book, not just specifically about stories, but um, how do you want it to serve, and what's the end goal here? Because you are going to share different stories, and you are going to write in a
Right.
different manner, or you're going to have different supporting information based on what you want that book to do. My book is for coaches to help them to
Right.
create profitable books. So the stories and the case studies that I share are different than if I was writing a memoir, for instance.
Right. Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
thinking about those things.
I love what you do with the Post-it notes, your brainstorm session. My
Mhm.
tasks look a little different, but that same thing. And I think as a tip that I would give that ties in with what you said, which is what has really helped me, is that when ideas come to me and they're like, it's like fast and furious, right? Whether it's an idea for
Yeah.
a keynote speech or it's an idea for a poem, I write it down. I don't pause to fix punctuation or
Yes.
spelling or wait, this line would look better this way. Like I just get it out, and then you can always go back, because I think sometimes we get tied up in the perfection of it because maybe we have a voice in our past that told us we were sloppy. So when I'm writing and
Mhm.
I accidentally write the wrong were instead of we're or something like that, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I was an English teacher, I have to just say to myself, like, just finish writing and go back and fix it. Right? You can get back to it. Because if you stop and you silence that free flowing, right? What you said, outside of academia, outside of structure, this is what I'm feeling, these are the words, then you can get back to it. But it comes out a lot easier when you don't try to confine yourself to how this is supposed to look on a piece of paper. I mean, I have a lot of poems that have literally been born of 15 different lines written that I thought were going to become their own poems. And then all of a
Mhm.
sudden I'm like, wait a minute. And so they come together. Had I not done it because it wasn't a complete poem yet, it never would have been able to create that finished product. So much like your Post-it notes, you can move things around, you
Yep.
can take things off and add things on, but like let yourself just be, enjoy that process for what it is.
Yeah, my mantra for myself, but I share it with my clients ad nauseum, is editing as you go keeps you slow. So it's this
Ooh.
process of, for my clients, it's about getting that messy first draft done. That's the most important part of publishing a book, is getting your first draft done, because if you don't have a completed manuscript, you don't have anything to work with. Right? You can't
Right.
bring on the copy editor to put the sparkle and shine. you can't do that. Only you have your intellectual property. Until you get that all down, you can't even do an effective self edit until you have the completed product.
Right.
So editing
Right.
as you go keeps you slow.
And also turn off, like I'll turn off internet and shut everything down, work in offline mode when I'm writing, so I don't get, you know, I mean, I have a relatively inexpensive Chromebook also that I can toss and kind of take out into the woods with me and things like that, where I can just write. But I think it is important too to detach yourself from all of these other areas and just let yourself write. Well, we are at 45 minutes, and I want to make sure, because
Wow.
I see some people. I'll make sure. I mean, I notice a lot of people will go back and watch
Yeah.
after the fact. But
Yeah.
two things I want. So the first thing is I want to make sure you tell everybody how can, like, what is the best way to communicate. You mentioned before them messaging on Instagram. So like, what is your Instagram handle? Whether they're interested in just getting some tidbits of advice from you, or obviously interested in working with you, reading your books, which are all available. What is the recommended way for them to find you?
Yeah, I would say really Instagram is a great touch point, and I'm at She Gets Published. And right on my bio, actually, right now, it says start here, and there's some information there. It's no opt in. You can just
Cool.
watch it, like a 10-minute video that shares a little bit about the Rapid Write system that I mentioned. But my DMs are open, and I'm
Okay.
always like, I love meeting people. Relationships are important to me. And it's a really, I've met the most, like, just incredible people through, it might be a social media. Deb, that's, we met on social media before we ever met in person.
Right.
Thankfully, I'm so
Yeah.
grateful for that opportunity. So yes, please do find me on Instagram at She Gets Published.
Yeah, I attest to the fact that you definitely have words of wisdom that are inspirational and educational rolled all together. And then last thing is one piece of advice that you would like to leave well, I shouldn't say advice because it doesn't necessarily have to be advice. One thing that you'd like to leave the audience with, something that you'd like to speak into whomever is consuming this now or after we're live, that you'd like to leave them with.
Mhm. Along the theme of story that's been woven throughout our conversation today, I think just to reaffirm this point of every person matters and every story matters. And um, you get to choose how you share that story, but to be generous with your stories. And
Mm,
it can be healing and empowering and uplifting for you, but you also never know the impact that that's going to have on another individual, what that trajectory is going to be. I think about this big, tsunami of goodness is what I talk about a lot of times, beyond the ripple. It's like, yes, you impact one person and that impacts their family and their community. And then, it just reaches out. So I think we've all experienced things that have value, and not to discount that. You matter just by the fact that you are here, and to share stories that can feed into other people and to help them advance. Also, right, there's lots of different reasons to share stories in different ways, but to value your experience and what you have to share, it's worth sharing. You're worth people knowing about and your experiences.
yeah. Yeah, there are people that are hearing that right now, I'm sure, and maybe have never had it said quite like that to them. So I am celebrating inside right now and outside, I guess, because I'm saying it, for everybody that just hopefully received it the way you talked about, allowing yourself to receive that feedback, and knew that that was for them specifically. So
Mm,
thank you for joining. I am excited for all of the opportunities that this is going to bring to people that you and I may never know about, right? But that there are going to be people's stories going out into the world now that might not have otherwise been shared. So that's a great day when that happens, when the world gets to learn more
absolutely.
about the beauty that's out there. So thank you very, very much. Thank you for all of joined us either during the live stream or who will be joining afterwards. We appreciate you. And I'll let Lanette say goodbye.
Yeah, love and appreciate you, Deb, for all the work that you're doing in the world and for the invitation to be here with you today. And just wishing everyone the very best. Share your stories.
Excellent. Take care, everyone.